Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we think we have a replacement for Adrian Griffin. Some conflicting reports that are out there. We will sift through that, and also we'll get Frank's reaction to the news that came down earlier today that the Bucks have, in fact, moved on from Adrian Griffin and potentially have a new coach in tow. We'll get into that after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined today by Frank Madden, the longtime host of the pod and founder of brewhoop.com. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, viewable on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Frank, Camille, and I sifted through the news earlier today, but we haven't had a chance to hear from you on your reaction to earlier in the afternoon on Tuesday that Adrian Griffin, 43 games in, a lot of comparisons to David Blatt. People overlooking the fact that David Blatt had a full season in-house before that firing, but Adrian Griffin relieved of his duties as head coach of the Bucks.
Yeah, it's funny. I got a text message when the news broke from a couple of my Wisconsin friends who I've lived in Austin a long time. Shout out to Connor and Bill. And I believe Connor had just basically texted like exclamation question, just like mashed the keyboard. And my first reaction was a trade. Like, was there a trade? And I think you and Camille talked about this as well. And so I immediately go to Twitter. I'm like, did they just make some sort of big trade? Like, what's going on? And then I see Adrian Griffin's face in the Woj breaking news tweet. And I was like, oh, okay. That probably makes more sense. But I'm still surprised at like the timing of it. I think, I became very concerned about Adrian Griffin's capacity to be the head coach of this team pretty early in the season when obviously there was the stumbles out of the gate. There was the defensive tactics, that first week or two. And there's the Stotts resignation obviously as well. But look, as fans, I think typically you want to give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, I don't think people came into this like wanting Adrian Griffin to fail and make mistakes and run Terry Stotts out of town and whatever, right? Like, I think we, as a fan base, got to this very sort of fractious state where, as you I think refer to as sort of the battle lines had been drawn, and unfortunately, like, any comment you made about Adrian Griffin seemed to imply that like you either, wanted him fired yesterday or, want him to be the head coach for the next 100 years or whatever, right? Like, it became this kind of caricatured debate. But I definitely lost faith, certainly, that this was the right hire early in the season, when just talking to people around the team, people who are closer than I am, and it was just, I didn't find anybody who was like, no, he's going to be good. Just give it some time, be patient, right? I think a lot of fans were saying, be patient, give it time, because that's a natural human thing to want to do, right? Not to want to fire your head coach right away. And talk to somebody who had previously worked for another team, who had known Terry Stotts previously, and who had some perspective on it and had heard again from that side of that story, like, just, man, what is going on with Adrian Griffin? Like, what's his deal? And so that got me very concerned. And, look, it's not that, any of us can look at the schemes and whatever and say, like, we can do a better job coaching an NBA basketball team. But when the issues and some of the decisions are as head scratching as they are, and as they have been over the past few months, and I think we've now gotten to the point where it just doesn't seem like it. We've kind of passed the event horizon of these guys buying into whatever, especially defensively, that Adrian Griffin was trying to get them to do. It just felt like this. I said it the other night, they kind of are who they are, right? It just felt like this team was now a version of themselves that probably was not what John Horst and ownership wanted them to be coming into this year. And you had to question, can this team legitimately compete with the upper echelon of teams in the NBA, namely the Boston Celtics in the East, even the Philadelphia 76ers, who you're still not behind in the standings, by the way. So I think on the one hand, I've had grave concerns about Adrian Griffin's ability to do this job for a while, but I've just sort of come back to like, man, are they really going to fire him? Because what's the plan, right? Like, does Terry Stotts want to come back? Is there some other guy there? Because, firing a coach in season ain't fun. And the only thing I was thinking of, Justin, it's been really cold in Wisconsin. There was the blizzard. It was actually really cold here in Austin as well. It was in the teens, which by Austin standards is very cold, especially given our houses are not built for cold weather. And, I went to the grocery store like right before it was supposed to get like super cold overnight. And it kind of got me that was when they were talking about firing coach and having to go find a new, it kind of got me thinking it's kind of like going shopping during a blizzard or right ahead of a blizzard. Like, you want your cupboards full going into a blizzard, right? You want to have your coach in a good spot. At least like, the Cavs, when they fired David Blatt, they had Tyronn Lue. He was the highest paid assistant in basketball to kind of be the waiting in the wings guy. Bucks did not have that at this point. And that's why they've now gotten themselves a situation where, they have to go seemingly here, obviously, outside the organization to make a hire, and your options are inherently limited. And so you are going to the grocery store and staring at a lot of empty shelves, and you may not like what you find because what you find may be old and considered undesirable to other people and stuff that's been sitting on the shelves a while. And I guess that's the way I'm transitioning into Doc Rivers, is the potential new Milwaukee Bucks. But yeah. I don't know. It's funny. I think my only comment, I'll pitch it to you to kind of give me your reaction on Doc Rivers as the potential head coach. But certainly, if this was the summer, any summer, I would not be excited about Doc Rivers as the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. But if Adrian Griffin has done nothing else, he has perhaps created a situation where many fans might actually be more interested in Doc Rivers becoming the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. So here we are, Justin. It's been sort of reported, sort of not reported, but it seems kind of inevitable that it will most likely be Doc Rivers. I don't know. What's your level of confidence going into the situation, and how should Bucks fans feel about it?
Really set me up there. I can't wait for the first interaction with Doc now with that setup from Frank. Look, we talked about it earlier in the day too, that it just seemed inevitable when you looked at the options, to your point, that were out there, that it seemed like, well, this is clearly going to be Doc. And I did have that conversation with a few others earlier. And, the question would keep coming up earlier in the year when you would just think about, man, they wouldn't really do something, would they, with these struggles that we talked about and some of the, you didn't see the progression that you were hoping for. And I think that was the reason behind the timing here. When you looked at, you have 2 games in Detroit of, okay, this is where we kind of need to see the stylish wins here, and we need the optics behind it. And you did not get that. You look at the schedule that's in front of you. You mentioned you're not behind Philly, but you're tied in the loss column. You're only 2 in front of the Cavs. So, like, if things go south in these 2 games, you're all of a sudden staring at 4th place, potentially 5th place, before the schedule becomes even more challenging. So I think that was kind of what they were grappling with here. But yeah, when you do this at this time of year, not only the options that are out there on the market, but the other thing that we do have to kind of get into is, it wasn't only the uncertainty over Adrian Griffin was a first-time head coach, and you had a roster that was built to compete for a championship now, even before the Damian Lillard trade. That exacerbated it, which is a pairing you don't often see. I mean, people can point to Ime Udoka. Internally, every team will tell you our expectations are championship, but that we weren't talking about the Boston Celtics as title favorites. So we're title contenders that year, that they grew into that, and Ime was a big part of it. It's just not very common. And the other part is, you mentioned you had Ty Lue on staff in Cleveland when David Blatt was dismissed. You think about the bench, and this is no knock on the group that you have, but it is also a largely inexperienced bench. When you think about Bud's group, where you had Taylor Jenkins go on to a head coaching job, Darvin Ham did as well. I know it wasn't in Milwaukee, but Kenny Atkinson found a head coaching job. Quinn Snyder too. That Bud had these guys. Charles Lee is the lead assistant in Boston. You didn't have any of that here, and I think that was part of the allure of Joe Prunty, but also Terry Stotts. Is these are two experienced guys that can help our young coach. When that left, when you didn't have that confidence in Terry Stotts and you didn't have a clear option, I don't know if I'd say panic, but then it became very dire of if we're gonna fix this, we got to find it externally. And it was kind of like in 2020 in March when you're going to Costco and other stores just trying to hunt down toilet paper, and you finally found some, but it wasn't maybe the best kind, but it's toilet paper. And I think that's kind of what the Bucks were looking at here. And Doc Rivers is, I think, for what this team, where this team is at, he's probably the best choice that you have. I know the names that are going to come up of Kenny Atkinson, who was a finalist. We mentioned Terry Stotts. That certainly would have been interesting given the relationship with Dame and just the narrative of now Terry Stotts returns 3 months later as the head coach. But the other part of it is everybody's going to point to Doc Rivers' playoff record and dig up some old narratives and tweets that they had about Doc over the summer. But it ultimately comes down to, number one, you just need to get better. You need stability. You need a coach that has been there before and that is experienced. And Doc checks all those boxes. But also, this is a super team. And I know we like to view it as like, we're just the upstart Bucks because we got Giannis. But you're a super team. You got Giannis and Damian Lillard. And you need a coach that can manage that and that can manage those egos and personalities. And that's the biggest box that Doc Rivers is going to check.
Yeah, and I think, Kenny Atkinson was the other name that's been mentioned. Shams and Eric in their story referenced Kenny Atkinson as being kind of the other guy that has been in discussions currently with the Warriors as an assistant. So again, if they really wanted Kenny Atkinson, like I would certainly imagine that Steve Kerr and the Warriors would allow him to take that job. And interesting, I mean, there is, some history of coaches, assistant coaches leaving teams midseason to become head coaches. Chris Finch in Minnesota is probably the most prominent example. Lionel Hollins, I think it was in 2009 when he was an assistant with the Bucks.
Yeah.
He had history, I think, in Memphis. And then went to Memphis and actually had some success there. He's kind of been lost to history a bit, but he went from a Bucks assistant overnight to an NBA head coach in Memphis. So, but I kind of agree with you. Like the flip side, if you're Kenny Atkinson, I mean, he's the kind of guy like I really would want a guy like him who, again, he's not like, some 35-year-old. He's not like Will Hardy or somebody who's like a very, very young assistant coach. I mean, he's been around the block. He's been an NBA head coach, but he also got run out of town in Brooklyn by some big ego superstars. Yeah. And again, I don't think Giannis and Dame are KD and Kyrie. But I think, asking him to parachute into a situation midseason with a bunch of assistants that he probably knows casually, but has not, I don't know if he would have worked with any of those guys. Yeah. That's a tall order. And I mean, what do Giannis and Dame think of Kenny Atkinson? I have no idea, right? It could have worked great. And if you told me in the summer you were picking a coach, like, I'd take Kenny Atkinson over Doc just because of, I think, maybe there's some upside there, and maybe Kenny's a bit more of that in between. Like, he has the experience, so he's not a total unknown. He's not going to walk into it and just be like, oh crap, I don't know how to run my own team, which I think, let's be honest, I think that's kind of what happened with Adrian Griffin. And I think back, I don't know, Justin, if you would have remember seeing this, but I saw a clip of Griff. It may have been when he went back to Toronto one of the two times early in the season, and there was a question just about like the difference between, when he was an assistant versus now being a head coach. And he kind of made this comment about, when I was assistant, like I was really just sort of focused on my stuff,
Yep.
And you can kind of be kind of one track minded. He's kind of the defensive focus. He's got, his scout, he's got this, that, and he got to kind of be like, kind of like in regular, like job world, you'd say like a
specialist, basically.
like an individual
Yeah.
performer, right? Like just somebody
Yeah.
who kind of does their thing. And again, obviously he's coaching other players and he's got to communicate. It's not like he's just sitting in front of a computer writing reports like Lawrence Frank writing reports for Jason Kidd back in the day. But that's a really random deep cut. But then he said like, oh well, now that you're a head coach, like now you got to run everything. And I think that's the risk, right? With hiring a guy into a head job who, it's not just that he hasn't been a head coach in the NBA, he hasn't been a head coach in the G League, he hasn't been a head coach in college. And so I think when you look at, for me now, that was something that kind of looked at, I was like, it's a bit interesting that he has so much experience as an assistant, but he's never been a head coach at any level. And what is that going to mean for his readiness and preparation and all that for being an NBA head coach? And again, being a G League head coach, I'm not saying that like means that suddenly you get how to manage the egos and everything else that comes with an NBA job. But I think when you look at Griff, or even kind of a Kenny Atkinson type, and you compare them to a Doc Rivers, I agree the ego management, the player management stuff. I think on paper, in theory, that is where a guy like Doc is going to make people, especially owners and GMs, probably feel like they have a higher degree of confidence that, again, he may not, I would not say Doc is a high ceiling coach, but he's probably a high floor coach in a situation like this, because he's not going to get overwhelmed by anything. He's been around the block. He's coached every type of player. And it's also not like he's been out of the league for a few years or something like that either, right? I mean, he's been continuously coaching for 20 years plus or something like that, right? This
24,
yeah. So he's I think again, like, if you want a guy who can come in and probably from the jump command respect from a group that I think is looking for someone, like, I mean, I don't think these guys are looking to disrespect the next coach or anything like that, but I think if you give them someone that has credibility, I think there's hopefully, knock on wood, and I could be wrong, but hopefully there's a higher probability that this group will buy in. And again, Doc Rivers, say what you will about him. We'll talk about the questions, I'm sure, at length for however long he is the Milwaukee Bucks head coach, which will presumably be for more than the next few months, but who knows? But yeah, I think there's at least I think there is a clear thesis for Doc, for all his foibles, as the coach to hire in a situation like this. And obviously we're going to find out pretty soon if that theory actually holds up to scrutiny.
24 years of coaching and 1 month of consulting, apparently, which we will get into coming up after the break. And also, again, it's not official with Doc Rivers, but the report of Doc Rivers as the head coach and where that came from. So we'll get into all of that with Frank Madden after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, Hungry Root is the easiest way to get fresh, high-quality food delivered to your door. They've got healthy groceries and simple recipes all in one place. Take a fun, short quiz, and Hungry Root will let you know your goals and how you should be eating. They'll ask what flavors you like, what kitchen appliances you use, and more. And then they'll keep your needs and preferences top of mind and start building your cart with delicious recipes and all of your grocery needs for the week. Hungry Root will recommend recipes and groceries based on your taste. They take your suggestions and choose anything you want. They've got fresh produce, high-quality meat and seafood, pantry staples, healthy snacks and sweets, and much more. They go beyond your weekly grocery haul with thousands of recipes that actually put your groceries to good use before they get forgotten all the way in the back of the fridge. The best part of this is Hungry Root follows a simple standard. It's got to taste good, got to be quick, and contain whole, trusted ingredients. Spend less time meal planning, shopping, and cooking, and more time enjoying healthy food that you'll actually love with Hungry Root. Right now, Hungry Root is offering Locked On Bucks listeners 40% off your first delivery and free veggies for life. Go to hungryroot.com/lockedon to get 40% off your first delivery and get your free veggies. That is hungryroot.com/lockedon. Don't forget to use our link so they know Locked On Bucks sent you. And passion, drive, and patience, that's what brings home the winning recipe. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with Guaranteed Fit from eBay, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, Frank, we mentioned it is not official, but there are reports coming out that Doc Rivers is going to be the coach of the Bucks. And the report came from CNN Sports, which was the most jarring thing of all. That a day after we find out about the demise of Sports Illustrated, their old counterpart, is breaking news over NBA coach hirings.
Yeah, and I don't even like when I saw CNN Sports, I was like, is that
Bleacher Report?
Is that a thing? Yeah, is that
Yeah.
because it's all sort of part of that weird sort of connected media empire, right? So yes, and there's now been kind of skepticism of whether or not that's real, and it's always funny to me when something gets reported, and then there's like the people that report, no, actually nothing's finalized yet. Like they get fed that from somebody, and it's never like it's often not the like big time newsbreakers who are the water pourers, oftentimes, because typically the water pouring is like a 12-hour type thing. It's like, oh no, hey, I'm here and nothing's final, and then 12 hours later the thing becomes final, and it's like, okay, thanks for really kind of scrutinizing that and making sure nobody got too far ahead of themselves. But yeah, we are operating under the assumption that certainly all indications are it'll be Doc Rivers. The other irony of the way this has been reported, Woj sort of made it sound like that there was kind of an agreement, right? And then he said, oh, or I don't know if Woj sort of, but then Woj made it sound like, oh, like they have not actually talked, but they are now going to be in contact, and that felt very much like Doc's people calling up Woj and be like, hey, he wasn't front running this. Make it sound like he's just been hanging back, and oh well, I guess if they have an opening, I'll talk to them. Which, of course, it is interesting that as part of this came out this news that he was, in some capacity, playing. I guess I don't know if Big Brothers Big Sisters or something stepped in and connected him with Adrian Griffin or something, but was sort of advising Adrian Griffin somehow. Sounded like it started, I think, at the play-in tournament in Vegas, I believe. They had some sort of interaction, and and honestly, like I'm not going to make a whole lot of this. We've seen people speculating, like, wait a minute, he was giving bad advice that wasn't working to Adrian Griffin, and now you're going to hire the guy. It's like, who knows, right? Like, I don't even know but it was Doc even getting paid for this, right? Maybe that was part of the appeal. He's already, in the HR system, and so it's just easier to bring Doc in versus bringing who knows, right? But I'm sure we'll find out a lot more very soon. And yeah, I mean, I think I think obviously the big question is going to be the playoff record of Doc Rivers. His record in, I don't know if you've got it handy, Justin, but his record in
whenever he's
games,
won 3 games in elimination games, and the 3-1 series lead and 3-0 series lead record. Yeah,
his teams have been historically, let's say, unimpressive when holding a lead in a playoff series, including obviously some very prominent flameouts. Look no further than obviously the Sixers a year ago. And so, of course, like there is an irony in him now being in Milwaukee, not directly following Mike Budenholzer, but succeeding Mike Budenholzer, who, of course, was fired in no small part because of the perception that he was not a great playoff coach. So again, we'll see. I think probably the most interesting hypothetical that I heard kind of thrown around was, this idea of, well, if you don't love Doc Rivers as your coach, then hey, maybe you would have just been better off, taking the L on this year, riding it out with Griff, going next summer, fire Griff, do a proper search, bring in a coach that you actually really like and that you believe in, and hopefully has some experience and is not a repeat of what we just saw. Versus if you're not hiring Doc Rivers, now you're in this weird position where let's be honest, I don't think they're getting Doc Rivers to pack up and move to Wisconsin, pack up his golf clubs, move to Wisconsin in the winter so that he can have 4 months of
Right.
guaranteed salary, right? Like there's presumably at least the 24-25 season. Who knows if they have to give him, guaranteed dollars beyond that. They're already paying Mike Budenholzer still right now. So they're going to be in a spot where they're paying probably 3 head coaches to have only one of them actually be head coach of the Bucks. So I think that's it. Again, like these are the trade-offs you're going to have to make. This goes into the challenge with making a coaching change at midseason, and you're not dealing from a point of power from a negotiation standpoint. So you're going to have to probably give Doc Rivers more money than you might want to under normal circumstances. So I think that's an interesting question. What his contract is will be interesting. My guess is it's at least 2 years, including this one, and very possibly 3. And if things don't go the way we want them to go in the playoffs, what is going to be the bar for Doc Rivers to remain the head coach going into next fall? Fascinating question, right? I don't think it's purely going to be reflected in the team record, though, because as we saw this year, there's so much more to ultimately how to judge a team and the perception of the team than what you see in the standings. And I will say this: I mean, I think this reflects poorly, obviously, on a lot of people in the Bucks organization, right? Like nobody looks good when you have to fire your head coach after 43 games. Like this is an unprecedented type of decision to make. Obviously, John Horst ownership, like they are obviously not happy. Doesn't reflect well on the process they went through last summer. Doesn't reflect well on Giannis, right? This being perceived as his hiring, and now he's, essentially had to a firing, presumably. I think that's a pretty safe bet that this did not come out of the blue to him. And of course, least of all, Adrian Griffin. But I will say one thing about this decision, and even though it is a very fast firing historically, like again, without precedent, especially relative to the success the Bucks have had in the standings, I think where teams get coaching decisions wrong is the hiring. I think hiring the right coach is hard, as we saw last summer. Although maybe the Bucks are really close to making a good hire. But hiring the right coach is hard. Knowing when to fire a coach, typically pretty easy. And I think, again, there have been great coaches that have been fired. There have been coaches that have been fired and then go on to great success elsewhere. But as we saw with Mike Budenholzer, I don't think it was a mistake firing Mike Budenholzer. I think the culture, the personalities, I think, regardless of whether it was quote unquote his fault of what happened in the playoffs last year, I think that version of the team needed something else to happen, needed a different voice. I don't think Giannis signs the extension when he does, if Budenholzer is still the head coach. So as much as it wasn't fair and it hasn't worked out hiring a replacement for him, I think it was still a move they probably had to make just because of everything that was going on around the franchise and the personalities. And so again, you can say, well, this was fast and the Bucks were impatient. Them making this decision, I think, validates all the concerns that people had and tells you that, yes, there were major issues going on with the team. Some of them we could see on the floor, some of them we could not. And at this point, to me, it always came down to, hey, if Giannis and Dame are out on the coach, then that coach is probably going to be out. And I think we can read into this that that's where those guys got to the point with Griff. And obviously, whatever patience there may have been with ownership and the front office, it clearly wore out for them to make a decision like this. But I'll give them credit, as much as this overall reflects poorly on them. I saw at least one comparison to this being the equivalent of John Hammond trading Miles Plumlee for like Roy Hibbert and Spencer Hawes or whatever that trade was, where he basically got out from under Miles Plumlee's bad contract that he had just given him. So this is kind of the the mea culpa
DJ
on our way.
Augustine all over
DJ
again,
Augustine,
too.
yeah, exactly. Turning DJ Augustine's water into PJ Tucker wine. You know, I give them credit though, because I mean, if you know something's not working, you know, you can just sort of
It
act
could
like
get
it's not a
worse,
problem.
right? I
But
mean,
yeah,
that's how it gets worse, is you prolong it. So if you recognize, and again, it's if you're making this move after 43 games, there's a clear recognizing that this isn't it. That the only thing worse is just trying to convince yourself it'll get better, and sticking through it and prolonging things. So to that point, while you didn't want to end up here, that is to a credit to the organization to say, look, we got to move on now because of things we'll get into coming up after the break, the window for this team, the age, and what you're facing with this schedule. Get into that. We do have the numbers on Doc Rivers. We'll get into that. And then one question I want to pose to you, which has been floating around quite a bit. I heard it between Zach Lowe and Tim Bontemps earlier today, and we've heard it in other places so far this season as well. So we'll get into all of that in the final segment of the show coming up next. Well, the NFL season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. And right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. Just go to FanDuel, use their app. It's easy to use, and a number of different betting options like live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab and make one of those parlays in the Parlay Hub. That is the best way to find all of those parlays out there. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, and Frank, lastly, as we've gone through with a lot of folks, not just Bucks content, NBA content. If you want more, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today. Find it 24/7, covering the top stories such as a coach being dismissed in the NBA after 43 games, you name it. We've got all the local experts you come to expect from Locked On, in addition to our national shows. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. The Doc Rivers numbers. He is 17-32 in series clinching opportunities. So not just elimination games, but when his team has the chance to close things out. 17-32 and 14-18 in elimination games, which I think a lot of us would have assumed that number much worse based on the number you heard, but 17-32 win or lose in those situations. Certainly, I think what you've heard most people mention, and not the good part there. I mentioned one of those questions, and while you do this now, so again, we talked about the schedule and what the Bucks are facing. You're in a big stretch now that you have the most difficult remaining schedule in the league. You look at the teams around you. The Celtics have the second easiest. The Sixers are in the middle of the pack. The Cavs, who are not going away, are in the bottom 10 for difficulty of schedule. So there's a very real chance, if things continue to go south, like you could be fighting for home court advantage or even to avoid that 4-5 series. So that's what you're facing. And I think you want a little bit of an on-ramp here, that there's going to be that honeymoon period. And the way that this works out, it kind of times up perfectly where you have that honeymoon. You're going to have a tough 5-game road trip where you go out west after this weekend. But then once you get through that, then you hit the All-Star break, and then you can work on some more things and you have some more time. So it really did seem like if you were going to do something, now was the absolute time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you could have argued you really should have done it before they got to go to Detroit for 2 games, right? Like get some theoretically easy wins under your belt. But I'm really curious to see how this team comes out against the Cavs this week. Presumably, Joe Prunty is going to be coaching the team, and at least in that first game. And I believe Joe Prunty had a 21-13 record, I think, when he was the Bucks interim coach, which is way better than what Jason Kidd had that year before he was fired. And I believe Joe Prunty was 2-0 as an interim with the Hawks.
Yeah.
in between when Nate McMillan was fired and when Quinn Snyder officially took over a couple years ago. So let's just knock out those 2 wins for us, Joe. Just get those 2 Cavs wins, get us to 32-13, move to 2-0 in your interim career with the Bucks Mark II, and set Doc up pretty well here coming in on the heel of a couple of wins. We'll see, but again, I think I just go back. Something again. I said it after the Pistons games this weekend. It just felt like this team had kind of gotten stale. Whatever message was trying to be sent, no matter what Giannis might say in post-game interviews, they kind of were what they were. And some of that was, that obviously they were continuing to do some similar stuff tactically, but also I just think psychologically with the players. Like, to me, that stands out more as the season goes on. It's less that, Adrian Griffin had made progressively worse decisions or something like that with his tactics as the season went on. I think the tactics got generally better. I think even some of the aggression they've stamped out a little bit that we've seen, not to say that they're where they need to be, but I think you just reach a point where, like, you're not going to get these guys to flip a switch, certainly not in terms of being a regular season kind of buzzsaw and just, again, kind of change their mindset. So does firing Adrian Griffin solve that? No guarantees. But that to me is the big question, right? Is I guess there's 2 questions. One, can this galvanize them from a regular season perspective? Can they unlock some things that help them win games in the regular season and tee up how they might be able to play in the postseason? And then obviously the real test is going to come in the postseason. And let's be honest, no matter who got this job in the summer, no matter who gets this job right now, the bar is championship. And even if you're the best team in the league, you're not going to be an odds-on favorite to win an NBA championship when you've got 29 other teams gunning for you and a number of other elite teams out there competing with you, and you got to win 4 rounds of the playoffs. So again, I don't think anybody's going to be happy with something less than a championship. But that's a really hard bar, and everybody's sort of set up to fall short of that just because of really like the nature of the NBA and how hard it is to win a championship. So dream the impossible dream, Bucks fans. I have a little bit more hope that they may figure some things out with a coaching change, regardless of who that ends up being. But it's going to be hard, and again, I guess we're gonna have lots to talk about just the rest of the regular season. No shortage of subplots to cover on Locked On Bucks, but perhaps not the kind that we are necessarily hoping to have.
A coaching change, and I think we would both assume there's going to be some type of movement leading up to the deadline, since this is the last chance really this group has to do anything. When you think about the constraints they're going to be facing in the summer with that second apron, that I would assume for that reason. If only for that reason, but there's obviously more to it that they're going to be active at the deadline. And again, it's not official yet, has not been confirmed with the Doc Rivers taking over as the coach of the Bucks news. But I feel pretty good because Magic Johnson tweeted, "Congrats to my friend and one of the best to ever coach in the NBA, Doc Rivers, for accepting the Bucks head coaching job." So I think that tells you it's a done deal.
But he tweeted that a couple hours after he said that it was a huge mistake that the Bucks had fired Adrian Griffin. So Magic really covering both ends of the spectrum. Adrian Griffin totally unfairly fired, big mistake by the Milwaukee Bucks, and also congrats to Doc Rivers.
But great news for my friend. Before we do wrap it up here, I mentioned that one question I wanted to pose. I've heard this a few times, and the chatter was a lot more loud earlier in the season. But on the latest Low post, Zach Lowe and Tim Bontemps did kind of get into this one as well. So I'm curious your take. If the Bucks had a chance to do it all over again, do they still make that trade for Damian Lillard? And even if they know that it sends Drew Holiday to the Celtics?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I've long felt the same way too. And Zach gets into it. I'm sure you'll give the same answer, but I think my feeling was, yes, I think they do, because I think you had kind of reached your ceiling with what that group was previously.
Yeah, 100%. It's similar to why they had to fire Bud, right? And again, we can look back and say, well, you didn't upgrade Bud, and you probably were always going to have a hard time upgrading from Bud as
Yeah.
a head coach. Stuff got stale.
Yeah.
Personalities, I think, reached a point where something had to be done. And I don't think, like, with Drew, I don't think it was, I don't think Giannis or Chris, like, or Brooke, like, it's not like anybody wanted Drew
Yeah.
Holiday to leave. That was obviously different from, I think, what the Bud situation was. But yeah, I mean, how many times can we see him be miscast offensively as kind of a lead creator in the playoffs? And I've said it after the couple of times we've seen Drew play the Bucks this year, like, even though the first game Boston really should have, I mean, they only won by 3, but really kind of dominated a lot of that game. Even in that game, what was it, the second half before Drew made a shot? The second game, they put Giannis on him basically as like, Giannis, you can roam off Drew. We're not that worried that he's gonna kill you. And he didn't. And again, Drew's had a solid year. He's shot the ball well from 3. Whenever I see him play, he just seems very tentative and kind of just disconnected, I feel like, and deferential. And so just watching Drew, even as good as he is overall, everybody would love to have Drew Holiday on their team, but him being 4th, 5th banana in Boston is one thing. Him having to be, 2A, 2B offensively in Milwaukee, I think just clearly was asking more than probably was reasonable. And even and you can bring Adrian Griffin into this part of the discussion too. I mean, there's a part of this whole discourse where you can argue that everything that happened this summer, whether the Dame trade, whether hiring Adrian Griffin, all those things, to whatever extent that those contributed to Giannis signing that extension, makes all of it worth it, right? If you hire Nick Nurse and you don't make the Dame trade, or you do make the Dame trade, whatever, even if you're in a better position as a team right now, if Giannis hadn't signed that extension and that was weighing on him, and he was going to go into next offseason potentially making a different decision than the one that he did already, maybe I will take, a lost season or a season that's more likely to be lost, just to know that you've got Giannis under contract under that long-term extension. So yeah, I think the Dame trade, you had to roll the dice on it. And again, just because the Bucks haven't managed kind of the rest of the roster and didn't make a good coaching hire, I think you start with unraveling the coaching problems, and then you start to think more seriously about kind of the roster too. It's the same way. It's like, hearing people talk about like the Bucks should trade Brooke Lopez or Chris Middleton. It's like, the one thing we know about this team that works is that when Chris, Brooke, Giannis, and Dame are on the floor, they're really freaking good. Yeah. And the defense is also even pretty good. Like, I'm always wary of comparing like lineup defensive ratings or offensive ratings to like overall like team rankings, because there's of course like huge distributions, right? Like the Celtics and Sixers starting lineups are like, Sixers like plus 34 or something like that, right? Like, you can't compare those to overall team ratings, but it is true. Like, the defense has not been horrible when the starting group is together. And overall, when you have your best players on the floor, things are really good. And again, this is a top heavy team. That just sort of makes sense that would be that way. And your bench is relatively thin due to just sort of the nature of the salaries and how this roster is constructed. But, again, we'll see. I think at this point, a trade makes sense, but I certainly would not bend over backwards to just try to move one of the core 4. I would much rather see what those guys look like with some new direction from a different coach. And if you can tweak the roster and the rotation outside of the top 4 guys, that's to me the approach that they should be taking. And certainly it seems like, Chris Haynes reporting that the Bucks are being very aggressive and looking to do just that.
We shall see. Again, I think it's all of our assumption that at some point on Wednesday, we're going to hear that Doc Rivers is the newest head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. We do know that John Horst is going to address the media as well at 5:15. I saw a lot of people jumping to conclusions, or if that's where you'll announce the head coach. That is also the time that the home coach addresses the media. So I always assume this was just let's kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We've got an interim coach that'll handle this, and that's when we can have John Horst address the media and handle some of those questions. But we will hear from John Horst prior to that game against the Cavs. And who knows, by the time we do get that, there may be an official announcement of Doc Rivers or potentially even somebody else getting this job to coach the Bucks. I still haven't seen any official word come through other than the Magic Johnson tweet. I don't know if you've seen anything change during the course of this show.
You have my undivided attention, so of course I don't know if anything else has been. No, but no, I have not seen it. But who knows what'll happen by tomorrow morning?
Who knows? It'll be a totally separate name altogether at this point. It's starting to give vibes of the offseason, that November night in 2021 when we thought the Bucks made 2 additions to their backcourt. And little did we know, a week later, it was just 1 addition that they made. Hopefully that's not the case, but I've already seen people mentioning some vibes of that. That's a good place to wrap it up. So who knows? Maybe tomorrow we'll know who the head coach is of
Kenny
the Milwaukee
Atkinson.
Bucks as they get set for 2 big games against the Cavaliers, and of course be back afterwards as well with the recap. For Frank, I am Justin. We'll talk to you then.